Hey guys, welcome back to the Bitcoin Magazine podcast. I'm Dave.
And Grahm over here.
Today's episode is going to be a little bit different. We're talking with Leo Weese, president of the Hong Kong Bitcoin Association, about the protests that have been happening in Hong Kong since April.
Right, and just a little bit of context. Hong Kongers like Leo have been protesting against this extradition bill, which if put into law would effectively allow any Hong Kong nationals or foreign citizens passing through the city to be sent for trial on the Chinese mainland, where courts are under the Chinese political party.
If you didn't already know, Hong Kong acts as sort of a pseudo-sovereign state, separate from China, which Leo will help explain. But basically, this bill is a big deal.
And freedom, liberty, sovereignty, these are all different values that Hong Kongers feel could be threatened if this bill is passed into Chinese law.
So without further ado, here's our interview with Leo Weese. Yeah, so before we were doing the Bitcoin Magazine podcast, we had another show. It was a little bit more about blockchain topics. But we did a few episodes on censorship in China. So we've covered a little bit. We were covering the Great Firewall, but we've looked at some of this stuff. And I was kind of getting caught up on the topic this morning, really. So I've got a very rough understanding, but I kind of wanted to ask you about it. And from what I can tell, you've been in a pretty unique position as far as seeing the protests and events week.
Yeah, I'd say Hong Kong is generally in a quite unique position. It's very much wedged between two different worlds, and it's a city full of contradictions. Also, when it comes to being, more and more subject to an authoritarian regime that wants to control everything, but still having free access to the world's information.
Yeah, and can I ask, can you just explain why Hong Kong is a separately governed and economic system than China, the rest of mainland China?
So this all goes back to 1840 when the European powers wanted to open up the markets in China, and they wanted to do so by force. China didn't have much to trade with Europe, so European nations, Britain at the very forefront. They forced China to open its ports, brought heroin, opium into the mainland, and established Hong Kong as its military base to protect this trade. And as China went through a couple of changes itself, there was a revolution in 1911. The Republic of China was founded. The communists started their rise in the 1920s. China went through lots and lots of turbulent times in the 20s and 30s and 40s in a civil war. And all that time, Hong Kong was a haven of stability for especially traders, for missionaries who wanted to spread Christian belief into China, but also for Chinese traders who wanted to make money by selling and buying. By importing and exporting goods. And in the 1960s, you would have a large influx of refugees coming from China, while Mao Zedong was, neglecting is maybe a bit of too weak of a word, but actively suppressing his population politically and culturally and economically. So millions of people fled. And many of them fled to Hong Kong, where they would find work in factories, in manufacturing toys or sewing together garments, assembling smaller electronics. And this made the city very, very rich in the 60s, and mainly in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, to the point where Hong Kong almost made up, of just back then, I think just 5 or 6 million people, made up a third of the GDP of all of China, which today has 1.4 billion people. And so China started opening up after Mao's death. And Hong Kong businessmen, as well as Taiwanese businessmen, were among the first to step a foot into the country and build factories there and make use of the country's newly established special economic zones that allowed some kind of capitalism in the country. And as as China grew more prosperous and became more open again, the time came to return Hong Kong to China, or rather to, as it's usually called in English, to hand over Hong Kong to China. So 1898, after the Second Opium Wars, Britain had made a contract with the Empire to lease the northern part of Hong Kong for 99 years. And so in 1997, this lease would be over. And of course, there's a lot of ambiguity in exactly what that meant and which parts would have to be given back. But since China claimed all of Hong Kong to be rightfully theirs, and since the UK wasn't too interested in maintaining colonies overseas, they didn't really know exactly what to do with Hong Kong. Margaret Thatcher and Deng Xiaoping did decide on some kind of agreement that would, resume sovereignty of the People's Republic, and that came with a catch, meaning Hong Kong was to be given its own constitution. That constitution was to be valid for at least 50 years, and Hong Kong's way of life was to remain unchanged. And what exactly that meant has, of course, been subject to a lot of debates and a lot of conflict. Mainly also because there are a couple of expectations in that constitution that would kind of give people the impression that Hong Kong would, for example, be given democracy, or the expectation that Hong Kong would get some kind of national security law that would make treason against the People's Republic of China a punishable offense. And of course, when Margaret Thatcher and Deng Xiaoping kind of discussed this, there was also the expectation in the West that as China would become richer and more open, more up, it would also become more democratic. And within like 2020, 2030, this wouldn't be much of a debate anymore anyway, because Hong Kong would become more like China, and China would become more like the West. And eventually, especially, you can imagine how confident the West was in the 1990s when they had just won the Cold War and they had emerged at the morally just pinnacle of civilization. And they were very much convinced that what happened to the Soviet Union would eventually happen to China as well, and that giving Hong Kong back, so to say, wouldn't cause much more issues. But now we are at the point where Hong Kong people feel like they are not Chinese, that they have their own identity, that they want to determine their own fate. They do want to be able to elect their own rulers. They do want to keep their freedoms. They want to keep their freedom of speech, their freedom of association, their property rights, their rights to travel, and they want China to sort of keep its promises that China made in those agreements, and especially in this constitution. But what China wants, and this is especially true for the last 5 years, where China has not only asserted more and more control over itself, over its own citizens, but also over Taiwan, over Hong Kong, over its immediate neighbors like the Philippines or Vietnam, and has even started to influence like European politics or politics in New Zealand or Northern America. And so people, I think, are quite understandably upset. And in this particular case, we are protesting a law called the Extradition Law Amendment Bill, which is not exactly an extradition treaty, but rather an amendment that would allow Hong Kong to extradite people for a certain list of offenses if China asks them to. And China still being under separate legal jurisdiction with proper rule of law and independent courts would, of course, very quickly lose all of its freedoms and privileges if China can simply demand anybody to be basically kidnapped on the streets of Hong Kong by the Hong Kong police and sent to China to camps and prisons where they're never heard from again.
What do people from Hong Kong call themselves? Hong Kongians?
Hangongyan, which means like Hong Konger or Hong Kongese.
Okay. So Hong Kongers elect their own leaders, don't they?
They elect a portion of parliament. So about half of parliament is more or less democratically elected. Some of the municipal, the district councils are also democratically elected, but the chief executive, who's sort of the prime minister, is elected by an election council of just around 1,200 people, some of which might have some democratic touches, but are mainly those are selected by Beijing and by the local business community.
And China's an extremely influential global power, so I would understand that something, Hong Kong appears like this, at least in economic terms, like a jewel that is not totally part of that nation. So I guess I can understand why China would want to have more control and influence on Hong Kong. But
yeah, I think for them it's really just like control for the sake of control. It's very easy to imagine a reality in which China is perfectly fine with having like a rich Hong Kong that rules itself, and that's still, as long as it calls itself part of China. But the Communist Party is also quite worried about its place in China, and it fears any kind of opposition from anybody. And of course, opposition that comes from within its own borders is seen as a lot more threatening. So this is also about silencing and preempting anybody who could challenge the CCP in their rule over China.
Leo, can you sort of take a step back and explain, maybe just explain it to me like I'm 5, why China would want to extradite somebody from Hong Kong? Why is this such a big issue?
Yeah, so I do have sometimes trouble understanding exactly what the thought process is of Chinese leaders as well. But think of it as it is a dictatorship, and this dictatorship does not have a lot of legitimacy over its own rule. It's not democratically elected. It doesn't really. It came to power itself through a civil war, through very simple violent means, and a lot of people don't want to see them in power. They have a lot of enemies, partly from, for example, the Nationalist Party that they went to war with. They have foreign enemies. They have inside of the Communist Party. They have different cliques that all want to rise to power. And now we have Xi Jinping as the president of China and as the party the secretary general of the Communist Party, and he is very paranoid about anybody threatening his rule. And so if there are people in Hong Kong who simply through their words, simply by publishing books and by speaking, create a following or have the charisma to potentially lead protests or lead labor movements that would threaten the party's rule, then that's something that needs to be avoided at all costs. And it's easy for the party to simply throw anybody in jail in China as they see fit already, and they would very much like to do that with all the Chinese dissidents, all the people that could threaten their power, no matter where they are in the world. And the fact that there is a little island just outside of their influence area that theoretically is part of their own country, that does not formally submit to this control, it's a big embarrassment. It's something that they probably also don't really, they probably consider this a big mistake that they ever agreed to this. And so now they want to turn that around, and they want to they don't want anybody to be able to voice opposition to their regime from within China, which means from within Hong Kong.
Leo, and can you tell us what the current atmosphere in Hong Kong feels like right now?
So over the last week, we had intense protests, probably the largest protests since the handover on Sunday. So on Sunday, June 9, we had about 1 million people marching in the street, and 1 million people out of a population of 7 million is a very impressive number. You can imagine how the subway system, the highly efficient subway system, completely collapsed under these numbers. How 1 million people that try to stretch along a 4, 5, 6 kilometer long road simply clogged the entire city for all of Sunday. And the response of the government to that was, we will go ahead. We do not hear your voice, and we will go ahead with this bill. So at this point, this hope that people felt being in this large crowd protesting this bill and protesting China turned into partly resignation, partly frustration, partly anger, and so now people start talking about different things. They no longer talk about just marching on the street, but they talk about blocking the government building, or they talk about a general strike. So on Wednesday morning, when the bill was supposed to be read in Parliament, Parliament still has to approve, even though Parliament is more than 50% pro-government and more than 50% appointed by Beijing. There is a 48 or something percent opposition that is partly democratically elected. There aren't that many government parliamentarians that you need to convince to not vote for this. So people started surrounding the government offices on Wednesday, June 12th. And they did so before morning rush hour in a way that caught the police by surprise, and in a way that mobilized people at exactly the time when they would have left their home anyway, meaning about 100,000, 150,000, mainly young people, surrounded the government building in anger and simply blocked all the entrances. And this led to the government not being able to open their doors that morning, meaning the parliament could also not open and the bill could not be read. And as the police tried to clear the area in the afternoon with firing rubber bullets and beanbags and 150 rounds, I believe, of tear gas into the crowd, people would simply not leave. And towards the evening, as people got off work, the crowds got even bigger. And so now slowly you have this feeling of not necessarily victory, but this feeling of hope again, where people feel like, yes, we can delay this, because at that point the government not only delayed the reading until June 26th, but kept the government closed for all of Thursday and Friday, which people consider quite a large victory. So now we have more smaller smaller demonstrations in town, mainly by like smaller interest groups. There's going to be another big demonstration on Sunday that is again expected to mobilize more the general population rather than just the young people, not just the people willing to stand tear gas, but the people who just want to show their face at the protests. And then I have no idea exactly what's going to happen, but there is a chance that this show of united opposition in Hong Kong does convince enough of the either government ministers or some of the government parliamentarians to either withdraw their support for the bill or to no longer keep pushing for it. And if the bill is delayed until around June 11, then Legislative Council will go into recess for the summer, and then the bill is very likely dead. And so a lot of the voices we heard now from pro-Beijing politicians or so-called heavyweights, or simply the tycoons have been a little bit confusing. Of course, there's lots of rumors. There's always the question of what does China really want with this, and how much are they willing to push. People are currently very carefully optimistic that this bill could be withdrawn, or that they could simply be powerful enough to delay the bill until a point where it no longer will no longer be pushed.
And who are the special interest groups who make up the protests? I'd also, and after you tell me that, I'd also like to know about just genuinely the people who are making up this protest.
Yeah, so on June 9, when you had 1 million people on the streets, you can really assume that the population is like quite well represented. You have like old people, you have young people, you have business owners, you have lawyers. The special interest group, like today, is a demonstration of mothers. You could call them a special interest group. There's been a couple of comments by the police, and a couple of, and especially the chief executive, who have referenced themselves as like loving mothers who just care for their population. And so now the actual mothers of those protesting are protesting against police violence tonight. Other special interest groups was probably like the lawyers. The lawyers demonstrated about 10 days ago, I believe. So they held called a silent march, marching from Central, where most of these law firms have their offices, to the government to petition them to voice their concerns. We could see, all sorts of the journalists are protesting in their own way. They, for example, showed up at a press conference today wearing helmets and wearing reflective vests to remind the people in power that they too were on the streets and that they too were hit by tear gas and rubber bullets.
And Leo, where do you find yourself in this conflict?
So the Bitcoin community in Hong Kong, I would say, is largely united behind these protests. There are a couple of businesses who have come out in quite strong opposition to this law. A few others have simply given their employees the choice of whether they want to work that day or not, or whether they want to protest. And so for our community, of course, we're very much concerned of this law as well. We're very much concerned of Hong Kong losing its special status. I think the status quo has served the Bitcoin community incredibly well. And especially the predictability of law is what keeps us here. Hong Kong is quite unique in the world in that it has a very predictable and easy to understand approach to Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a virtual commodity here. It can be legally traded. It can be legally owned. Business can make use of it in any way they want to see fit, without having to apply for special licenses or without having to worry about taxation issues too much. It fits in really relatively well. There's, of course, a few barriers in Hong Kong. For example, banks have more or less collectively refused to deal with Bitcoin businesses. But there's not really any worry that somebody who uses Bitcoin in Hong Kong needs to, even worry so much about filling out special forms. There's no capital gains tax here. We don't have VAT. There are theoretically some KYC and AML requirements for general commodities too, but they are far less strict than that for money. And the about 30 or 40 ATMs that exist in the city will sell you Bitcoin without you having to show your ID, for example. And if now Chinese law is applied in Hong Kong through the use of such forced extraditions, then of course we need to suddenly worry about what the legal situation of Bitcoin is in China, and nobody knows anything about that.
Do you see this might be a stretch, but do you see Bitcoin as a method for protest against this issue?
No, not so much as a direct issue of protest. I do think Bitcoin is an important tool for these people as well, to keep accepting donations for their supplies, to keep their savings outside of a banking system that can just easily turn against them. It's a very practical tool for people. But what matters for people on the streets is more the ability to quickly communicate with each other, the ability to not fall asleep, and lucky weather. The money is not so much an issue for these protests. I do think there's some. So in this case, in this protest, I think the banks have been surprisingly favorable of the status quo. Not so much that they openly support the protesters, but they have not come out in support of this law. And some of the major banks, including HSBC and Standard Chartered, have sort of low-key signaled that they are okay with their employees going to protests. But of course, the Chinese government is very much propped up by its banking sector, and I have seen reports of people withdrawing cash in large numbers from mainland Chinese banks. So people who had bank accounts with mainland Chinese banks would close them or would withdraw all their cash. So that's something where Bitcoin can be an interesting alternative for those, or simply where we're just reminded of the fragility of any kind of banking system that can easily be brought down by a bank run. We've also seen people queue up at subway ticket stations, subway ticket machines, because they didn't want to use electronic payments to purchase their tickets, because this purchasing history could later be used against them to prove that they took part in some kind of illegal protest. And so we're very much aware of the fragility of the banking system and Bitcoin as an alternative to storing your wealth, as well as Bitcoin as an alternative to making anonymous transfers. But I don't think it's being used on a large scale by these protesters, and it's not something they're currently worrying about. They're worrying about how to build barricades and how to resist tear gas.
And I understand the app Telegram has been used a lot as a method for communication and organization for these protests over the last week. Could you talk about that?
Telegram has proven to be a very efficient tool of communication. Similarly efficient as Twitter, but not as open, not as much in the public. Telegram has been proven to still work even when the internet is very slow. You can imagine when 150,000 people surround a government building, that the cell phone masts in the area are quite overwhelmed. And Telegram is often one of the last apps that's still working. So even if you just have 2G internet, you can still catch up with your Telegram chats, and you no longer can catch up with Signal, and you can no longer catch up with WhatsApp, for example. WhatsApp also has like a limitation on group size. And I think the fact that these groups are encrypted in WhatsApp matters very little to these people, because in a group of 250 people, or when you're looking at Signal, you have groups with 1,000 people, 10,000 people. Encryption doesn't really matter. You have 10,000 people in a group, somebody is going to be a mole. There's too much of a risk that these one of 10,000 people is going to be arrested or lose their phone on the street, and suddenly a police officer gets to see the chat. And what matters here is that the police should not be able to see who is in the chat. And in WhatsApp, it's very easy for police to see that because everybody's just listed with their phone numbers, and same in Signal. But in Telegram, that's not the case. In Telegram, you can hide your phone number from even your contacts, and you can refuse to sync your contacts with the cloud, which you also cannot do in WhatsApp. And then you can just give somebody, even somebody you've never met, simply your Telegram username. They can add you to a group, and you're now part of a communication network, without being at risk of the admin or any other member ratting you out to the police.
Yeah, and from what I understand, also Telegram experienced a DDoS attack in the Hong Kong area this week too.
Yeah. So that did impair service a bit more than like the cell phone services. But for example, for me, it worked relatively well. I do think Telegram responded to that quite well. I did hear complaints that people can't open it, but on a large scale, I would argue that the DDoS attack failed.
And I read that one of the group organizers for I believe it was a Telegram group, was tracked down by the police, and he was not even taking part in the protests, but the police entered his house and.
Yeah, and I'm not 100% confident that I know how this person got caught, but I do assume it was through the phone number. So somebody would have their phone number in their address book, or their phone number was visible to everybody, and now the police arrested them. And so the police did also now force them to hand over the phone numbers of other people in the group. And I think it's quite important that this admin is not able to do that. Like, for an efficient messaging system that can be used in such mass protests, the users also have to be sort of protected from the admin. And yeah, it's probably good news that the police isn't able to figure this out themselves, who is in the group. And I very much hope that the admin wasn't able to like turn over a large number of the members, because as we've seen in the past, these trials are not necessarily fair. They are, they're quite problematic, to the point that 2 people charged with rioting in 2016 have been granted asylum in Germany this year or last year. Meaning, somebody in the German ministries that decide on these asylum cases was convinced that these activists would not receive a fair trial in Hong Kong.
Wow. On your Twitter, you've been giving advice to people similar to what you're talking about now, about what people can do if they're organizing to keep their communication private.
Yeah, absolutely. I believe privacy is a very basic human right. The freedom of speech and the ability to communicate is vital for the functioning of any open society. And so spreading the knowledge on how to protect yourself online is something that I'm quite passionate about.
And these are different topics and different scale protests, certainly. But I was thinking, when I was reading about this morning, I was thinking about the Arab Spring and how important social media was in that. And I don't know if you have made that comparison, or if you could sort of maybe contrast that.
Yeah, sadly, I'm not an expert in what happened in Syria or Egypt or Tunisia at that time. There are probably a lot of parallels. I think the biggest difference is that these people were yearning for freedom. These people were inside of repressive regimes, and they were demanding rights. And Hong Kongers are inside of a relatively open and liberal regime. They're in some of the freest economies in the world, and I do think, in general, they enjoy a very high degree of personal liberty. And what they demand is to keep those liberties. So it's going to be much more difficult to convince them to give those up. But they also have, of course, a lot more knowledge and a lot more overseas support, because that's where their personal networks are. And Hong Kong does not have censored internet. These people do not need to first figure out how to jump the Great Firewall. They do not. There is no ability for the Hong Kong government at this point to censor Twitter or to shut down Telegram, and that changes the game quite a lot. That makes things very different to Egypt or Syria or Tunisia.
And just to take a step back, what brought you to Hong Kong?
I came here to study. I did my master's here in statistics in 2011. And shortly after, started organizing the Bitcoin meetups here in Hong Kong, which have now turned to the Bitcoin Association. It's been 8 years for me in Hong Kong. Quite exciting years. Seen a lot of seen Bitcoin change throughout the years and the community grow. But Hong Kong luckily did not change much. I think Hong Kong's one of Hong Kong's biggest strengths, but also weaknesses, is its ability to resist change. Right, the entire constitution and the entire political system was set up to resist any kind of change. This could be in good, right? Because we are facing a very powerful organization to the north that would very much love to change Hong Kong. And the fact that they haven't been able to do so is probably incredibly frustrating for them. And a big illustration for how important these independent institutions are and how important civil society is. But at the same time, there's a lot of things where we think Hong Kong should probably change. There's a lot of ways Hong Kong is not always a very livable city, and Hong Kong is not always really going with the times. It's not a very technologically advanced place. It's not a very LGBT-friendly place. It's not a very it hasn't done a lot to reduce car ownership or to increase like green spaces in the city, as for example, the cities in the United States or Europe would have done it. But yeah, the fact that Hong Kong does so much on the side of the status quo probably does lead us to be a bit hopeful that as Hong Kong unites behind the status quo in this case of saying no to a new extradition bill, that they will succeed.
It sounds like you love Hong Kong, and in your Twitter bio, you call it the everlasting thriller. So
yeah,
do you think you would ever leave Hong Kong if you
had to? I'm a big
fan.
At some point, of course, I will leave. It's not that I want to be trapped here, or it's not that I want to see the city die, or it's not. I don't want to be the last one to turn the lights off. But I am still hopeful for Hong Kong, and I don't think that Hong Kong is dying just yet. It's facing probably its biggest threat ever. But in a way, I'm much more confident of what Hong Kong will look like in 30 years than what China will look like in 30 years.
And can you talk about the Hong Kong Bitcoin Association? I think that is your current job right now, right?
Yes, it's not exactly a job; it's a role. I do have other smaller jobs that I do to cover my living expenses. And the Bitcoin Association is something like a hobby, something like a role, something like a passion. We are a community of enthusiasts and entrepreneurs and developers who are excited about Bitcoin. Some of us are excited more about Bitcoin in specifics, other more about things like Lightning or even altcoins or general blockchain. It's a relatively broad and colorful community. We would host, of course, the meetups. This is probably the most long-standing event that we've hosted. They look very similar to most meetups in the world. Please say hi when you're here, Bitcoin HK on meetup.com. We would also host talks, panel discussions. We would host a job fair happening tomorrow, June 15. We are hosting a conference for cryptocurrency exchanges, July 29. We hosted the Lightning Hack Day in March 30. So those are sort of the type of events that we do. On top of that, of course, we would help out anybody who is hosting events here or is coming through. Very excited about like connecting the Hong Kong community to the world and vice versa.
Yeah. And what's your background? Where are you from?
I was born in Italy.
Okay.
Grew up mainly in Germany, Austria. I studied economics in Vienna, moved to Hong Kong, studied statistics, worked for a data analytics firm, and later for a logistics consultancy. That was around the time when I got big into Bitcoin. And yeah, over the last years, been writing about information security and online privacy topics. as well as teaching about Bitcoin and lecturing on this whole range of subjects.
That's awesome. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about that we didn't touch on?
Not that I can think of anything now. Great questions. Lots of fun topics.
Leo, are you planning on going to the protest today?
I believe there will not be too much happening this Saturday. I will go on Sunday for sure. I will definitely at least drop by, and then we'll see what the next week brings.
I had one last question. I just kind of wanted to ask you, when you're in that large crowd and you're, standing there and facing off against police, can you just sort of describe like what the police are doing and what the feeling is like?
Most of the times in the protests, there wouldn't be much police visible. Most of the time, people are marching peacefully or they're sitting on the streets, and people are incredibly peaceful. There's absolutely no violence. There's not even theft. There's not even people being rude to each other. People separate the trash. They will make sure they clean up after themselves. There are these instances when police build up barriers. They would position themselves with shields. On Wednesday, we for the first time saw people shooting rubber bullets into the crowd to get people to flee, to repeatedly cover the area in tear gas to get people to run away. And so you don't have this type of protests that you would have in Europe or let's say at G8 or WTO protests in North America, where people come well prepared for a riot and then face off police by throwing stones. You have these standoffs. You have the police throwing tear gas, everybody running away, assembling at the next corner. Police, of course, have to reassemble as well, and then protesters come back. And the main goal is to keep the government buildings locked down. The main goal is to keep people from being able to hold their meetings and from being able to conduct their bill readings. And it doesn't really matter whether then people face off the police directly outside of the government entrance or whether that there's a perimeter a few hundred meters away. What matters is that wherever government employees are dedicated to enter the area, that this entrance is blocked.
And during these protests, when people are out and they're standing together, I imagine there people are chanting, or there are pickets. What are people saying?
I think if I pronounce it right, the protest slogan for Wednesday has mostly been "Tik Moy," sort of repeal the bill. Tik Moy, I think Tik Moy, repeal the bill. So they would scream "Repeal the bill, repeal the bill," not bring the bill forward. The protest slogan, the dominant one for 2014, would have been "Ngõ Yu Jampo Xun." I want universal suffrage. Much less catchy, but. Then there are a couple of others. People, of course, call the police names. They would accuse the police of being triads, or they would ask for the chief executive to step down. Those are sort of the things that I pick up.
Okay, cool. Thanks so much, man. I really appreciate you talking to us. I know it's late over there.
Yeah, very happy to talk about this. Thank you for helping spread the word about Hong Kong.
Yeah.
In addition to Bitcoin.
Well, just your willingness to talk to us is very heroic. So we really appreciate that.
We look forward to seeing you at Bitcoin 20.
Yeah, looking forward to seeing you in San Francisco.
What, 9 days, 8 days?
And we will definitely buy you a beer.
Yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. Can't wait.
All right. Take care, man.
See you there.
The Bitcoin Magazine podcast is a BTC Media produced podcast on the Let's Talk Bitcoin network. Today's episode was produced and edited by myself and Dave. Theme music provided by Billy Sly from the Crypto Cantina. And a very special thanks to our guest, Leo Weese. Be careful over there in Hong Kong in the protest and travel safely to Bitcoin 2019. We'll see you soon, buddy. Visit bitcoinmagazine.com for more in-depth news, analysis, and resources about the most successful peer-to-peer currency. And make sure to follow us on Twitter at Bitcoin Magazine. You can find more engaging crypto podcasts over at letstalkbitcoin.com. You can follow them on Twitter at the LTB Network for all the latest episodes. Be sure to subscribe to the show on the Apple Podcast app, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever else you listen to your podcast. And you can even find us on YouTube, so make sure to subscribe to us there. If you've got the time, please leave us a review. It really, really helps the show, and you already know that. Again, guys, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.